This is a wonderful evening tonight. Professor Frank Fukuyama is visiting with us after, 18 years? No, 18 years, because last time when you appeared with us, it was 1998 at the University of Pennsylvania. You say
yeah, that's even more than 18.
Yeah, wonderful. Okay, I'll have one of my interns introduce you, Frank. David.
Thank you, Dr. Kim.
Okay.
Ladies and gentlemen, today I have the honor of introducing our distinguished speaker. Francis Fukuyama is the Olivier Namalini Senior Fellow at Stanford University's Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies and a faculty member of FSI's Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. He's also director of Stanford's Ford Dorsey Masters in International Policy and a professor by courtesy of political science. Francis Fukuyama received his BA from Cornell University in Classics and his PhD from Harvard in Political Science. He was a member of the Political Science Department of the RAND Corporation and of the Policy Planning staff of the U.S. Department of State. From 1996 to 2000, he was Omar L. and Nancy Hurst Professor of Public Policy at the School of Public Policy at George Mason University. And from 2001 to 2010, he was Bernard L. Schwartz Professor of International Political Economy at the Paul H. Nitz School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. He served as a member of the President's Council on Bioethics from 2001 to 2004. Dr. Fukuyama holds honorary doctorates from Connecticut College, Doane College, Doshisha University, Kansai University, and Aarhus University, and the Pardee Grand Graduate School. He is a non-resident fellow at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. He is a member of the Board of Trusts of the RAND Corporation, Board of Trustees of Freedom House, and the Board of the Volcker Alliance. He's a fellow of the National Academy for Public Administration, a member of the American Political Science Association, and of the Council on Foreign Relations. Please welcome Francis Fukuyama.
Thank you, Frank.
Okay, thank you very much.
Go ahead. It's all yours.
All right, thank you for that. Thank you for that kind introduction. So yeah, it's actually been 28 years since.
28 years.
Yeah, I suppose it's 1998.
Yeah.
It's funny, when you get older, the decades fly by and you can't even remember how many decades it's been since something happened. It's really terrible. So let me just say briefly, there's been so much commentary on how the world has changed since January 20th. And I don't want to repeat too much of what other people have noted, but we're obviously living in a very different period right now in which virtually every premise of the existing liberal world order is being challenged and undermined. And I think that, the damage that's being done to that order is something that's going to be very difficult to repair. So over the last couple of weeks, everybody's been focused on the tariffs and the financial markets in reaction to that, and the trade war that has broken out between the United States and China. I'm going to get back to that, but I actually want to start at a different place because it's a really great personal concern to me. Back in 2014, my center, the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law at Stanford, began a series of programs aimed at young Ukrainians. By young, I mean mid-career, people in their maybe 30s and 40s who looked like they were up-and-coming leaders. And the reason we did that was after the Russian occupation, this was the real beginning of the Russo-Ukraine war, but after the occupation of Crimea, we believed that this was going to be the central battleground of a global fight between democracy and authoritarian government. A lot of people at that time didn't take it that seriously. They thought of it just as a regional dispute. But I think that since the opening of the full-scale invasion in February 2022, people have understood that this isn't, just a border skirmish, that this is a much more important conflict. And, it's really a conflict over the world that had emerged after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the dissolution of the former Soviet Union. For me and for other people that lived through that series of events, that was one of the most momentous and actually joyous periods in my lifetime, because all of these countries that had been living under communist dictatorships all of a sudden were able to make a transition to something like liberal democracy. Many of those transitions got stalled. They weren't complete. There were a lot of problems with corruption, with policy, all sorts of things. But it was very hard to think of another moment where human freedom had expanded that rapidly. And I think that there was one person that did not see it that way. Well, actually, there were a couple of people that didn't see it that way. And one of them was Vladimir Putin, who has at great length explained how, this was actually a big world historical tragedy, that the Soviet Union fell apart. And he's, I think, explained pretty carefully that his long-term objective in launching the full-scale invasion was really to put as much of that old communist world back together. You have these people like John Mearsheimer and Jeffrey Sachs that run around saying that he did this because he felt threatened by NATO expansion. I don't want to get into a long discussion of that, but I think that's really an argument that has very little merit. Now, that really defined, I think, the moral universe in which geopolitics was unfolding through that entire period. And I think that one of the most amazing things that I've ever seen in my life was that meeting in the Oval Office between Trump and J.D. Vance on the one hand and Zelensky on the other, whatever it was, 6 weeks ago, when basically they humiliated a man that had stood, very bravely to defend his country against, a very ruthless dictatorship, upbraided him, and ever since have been basically, they claim to be mediating an end to the war, but basically they've done nothing to pressure Russia, and they've taken Russian positions on virtually every point of conflict. And it seemed to me that that was, a kind of monumental moral failure on their part. And it indicates, I think, the political basis of this reordering, because as J.D. Vance and Trump himself have said, they believe that the bigger enemy are liberals in the United States, that, Russia, China, these other dictatorships that we had organized, the global system to defend against. We had created alliances, both in Europe and in Asia Pacific, in order to contain that threat, that all of a sudden we were somehow switching sides. And this, I think, corresponds to the upheaval in American domestic politics, because well, we can discuss this at greater length. I think there's a very curious relationship that Trump has had with Vladimir Putin and with the Soviet Union and Russia more generally. But so it does reflect, kind of personal history on his part. But unfortunately, I think it reflects a broader view among a certain part of the American right now as to this moral universe, that they really do regard domestic liberals as a bigger threat culturally than these overtly authoritarian great powers. And so that's something that has been rippling through the world system. I just had a long talk with a couple of German journalists. They wanted to know my opinion about what they as Europeans ought to do. And, every time a European has asked me that in the last month or two, I've said the same thing. You've got to spend more money on defense. You've got to do it on your own. You're not going to be able to count on the United States, even if a Democrat is elected in 2028. I think it would be imprudent of you to believe that America is simply going to go back to the kind of alliance commitments that it maintained up until 2008 2016. We thought that the United States had come back, when Biden was elected in 2020, but it turned out that that wasn't the case. And there's now a very substantial part of the American right that actually is more comfortable with these strongman leaders like Putin and Xi Jinping than with, many of their countrymen. And I think this also has big implications for the distribution of power in the global system. The United States, on paper, is still, the world's leading superpower. We've got the most, not necessarily in manpower terms, the largest military, but certainly the most effective military that has incredible reach. Our logistics and foreign basing structure give the United States ability to project power really, across the world. There's no other neither Russia nor China can do anything like that. But in a sense, that power doesn't matter if you don't have the internal unity to actually make use of it. And that is what I think has been deteriorating. I've felt for a long time that the single greatest weakness on the part of the United States is really its internal polarization, and the fact that Americans actually can't agree on what they want to use that power for. And I thought it was very revealing, in that Signalgate publication of the internal messaging that people in the Trump administration had done over this attack on the Houthis in Yemen that they somehow shared with the Atlantic editor. One of the most amazing things was what J.D. Vance said. That I said, well, passage through the Red Sea and the Suez Canal basically affects the Europeans. It doesn't affect us that much. So why should we care about it? And it reflected a kind of cultural contempt for the Europeans that I've just never heard another American president express. And I think, so that gets us into economic policy where, the Biden administration had shifted towards greater protectionism. They kept many of the Trump tariffs, but that was still based on a distinction between Democratic friends and authoritarian rivals. And so most of their efforts were to direct trade away from China and towards other democracies or countries that had a beef with China, like Vietnam, such that our supply chains wouldn't be interrupted in the course of a confrontation with China. And that's simply gone. The retaliatory or the reciprocal tariffs that were announced on April 2nd were, kind of indiscriminate. They hit friends and enemies. And in fact, they didn't hit Russia at all. It eventually escalated in the case of China, but, really some of our closest allies were the objects of some of the highest tariffs. I mean, there wasn't really a systematic way of calculating what the level should be. But again, it gets back to this fundamental moral revaluation of all values, where you're now going to pick friends and enemies not on the basis of any kind of set of shared values. You're simply going to do it on the basis of power. The other thing that I think is very surprising about this new world that's emerging is I and many other people had thought that Trump was fundamentally an isolationist. He was always complaining about forever wars and not wanting to deploy American forces. Now, that is something that a lot of Americans agree with. Barack Obama criticized the Iraq invasion. There's been a general consensus that we got overextended in many of our interventions. We were trying to remake the Middle East in an area where we didn't really know what we were doing. So there's something to that. But this is not isolationism. This doesn't explain wanting to take Panama and Greenland and turn Gaza into a high-end resort. This is a kind of expansionism that you really haven't seen since the 19th century. And if anything, if there's a kind of consistent principle, it's sort of a return to 19th century multipolarity and great power diplomacy. Now, if we really were going to go back to the 19th century, to something like the Concert of Europe, there's a certain case to be made for that, because the world is indeed multipolar. Our interests don't necessarily align all the time with that of our democratic friends, but it means that there needs to be a certain flexibility where you are willing to align with another great power if you're threatened by somebody that's trying to upset the system as a whole. That was the old Concert of Europe. To some extent, the Trump people are trying to make the argument that that's what they're doing with Ukraine, that they want to peel Russia away from China. I think this is kind of nonsense. First of all, it's not going to happen. There's no way that we can offer them anything that's going to be sufficient to make them give up on Ukraine. And there are good and enduring reasons why Russia and China will continue to work together. But I think that Americans are not ready to move into a world in which values play no part, and you're simply going to make these power calculations as to how much you can grab and who's going to help you, grab it. So this is, I think, the situation. I think that we're also facing a major crisis in terms of our rule of law institutions in the United States itself, and the fractures within American domestic politics align with the fractures now that are emerging in geopolitics. And so, in a way, it's one continuous set of crises. So maybe I should stop at this point. There's a lot to talk about, especially whether this is a sustainable world that is being created by the new administration, and whether there's going to be pushback, and if there's pushback, what that's going to look like, and then how these different trends play out in different parts of the world, in Asia, in Europe, and so forth. All right, so you said 15 minutes. I think.
Thank you, Frank.
Yeah.
It's right on. Now, before we get into the Q&A session, let me make a small comment. ICAS is not an agent of any government or foreign principals. There's no foreign funds involved in ICAS activities. That said, now the floor is opened. Who's going to shoot first? Andy. Go ahead, Andrew.
All right.
Okay.
So it sounds, Frank, like you agree with an article in Foreign Affairs, The New Issue by Stacy Goddard.
Yeah.
So I guess an interesting question is, and I agree with it as well. So if Trump tries to create this concert of the three great powers, all the other 190 countries in the world also have agency, and they will react. So, of course, in this group, we're concerned about Asia Pacific. Do you think that Japan and South Korea will go nuclear?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. There's a real logic to their doing that. I don't want to say it too loudly because, I don't think they need to be encouraged to go nuclear. But, basically the post-World War II settlement took an essential element of sovereignty away from both Germany and Japan. Because they had been troublemakers, they were going to be demilitarized, and the United States would substitute its military power for their missing sovereignty. And that included, the sovereign right to own and deter with nuclear weapons. And if that deterrent is now no longer credible or reliable, it makes a lot of sense for them to think about nuclear weapons. And in Asia, it's I think a little bit more urgent than in Europe, because in Europe you still have some form of extended deterrence. NATO has a lot of conventional capabilities. Europe collectively can, on paper at least, they look pretty impressive, and they could probably hold Russia off if they made the right kinds of investments. In Asia, because of the friction between Japan and Korea, you don't really have anything remotely like an Asian NATO. And every time anyone has tried to suggest that the region needs that, the idea gets shot down right away. But that means that, they've got individually, Japan and Korea have an incentive to consider a nuclear option. I suspect the way that will work, my understanding is that Japan, for example, is, I don't know, a year, 18 months away from making a nuclear weapon. If they wanted to make a nuclear weapon, they clearly have the technological capability to do that. But they don't want to explicitly do that. It'll be controversial domestically and internationally as well, because, again, I mean, what makes Asia different is that the major powers there really don't like each other, and so you can't really have a clear bulwark against Chinese expansionism. But I think it's going to be on the table, and over time, I just think that people are going to, think about that more and more. Actually, Andy, I'd be curious your view, because if I were Xi Jinping, I would say that this is a great opportunity, for getting Taiwan back, because the United States, is led by somebody. I cannot imagine circumstances under which Trump would actually want to use military force to defend Taiwan, and he's alienated every conceivable friend that could help in that effort. What's your opinion?
I think when Xi Jinping sees the United States power declining so rapidly, he's a smart person. He will wait for the U.S. to weaken all the way down to where the Taiwanese see the situation, and then they have to negotiate. But there is a risk that Trump hasn't indicated. He's so emotional, and if he feels insulted by Xi Jinping, he could do something, make some remark about Taiwan that would actually force Xi Jinping to use military force. But if Trump doesn't do that, then I think Xi Jinping will wait for nature to take its course.
Very interesting. Until the nature takes its own course. That's what Andy said.
Yeah, meaning that
Yeah.
the U.S. is declining. So, the relative power of China and the United States has been shifting in China's interest, including the biggest navy in the world and so on. But Trump has accelerated that process very, very fast. So Xi Jinping can wait and watch and see what happens.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the only problem with that strategy is that, Trump may be defeated, and the United States may try to actually come back in some version of its old self. So they've got kind of a window of opportunity right now.
Well, if Trump wants to negotiate with Xi, then Xi can roll him. I mean, Trump doesn't understand the Taiwan issue, the value of Taiwan. Xi can say, "I'll buy soybeans. You give me Taiwan." I mean, he knows what what Trump will give away. Like you remember when he was negotiating with Kim Jong-un, and Kim Jong-un said, "The trouble is, you guys have exercises with the South Koreans, and that's making me unhappy." And Trump is like, "Oh, we could stop those exercises." So I mean, Trump could, who knows?
Yeah. Okay. Well, that's true.
That's true. So soybean and Taiwan. Good. David Lee, go ahead.
Hi. Yeah. I just had a question in the context of both Japan and South Korea. Regardless of whether or not they choose to go a nuclear route or anything like that, I was wondering, given the economic pressure that they're under with the tariffs, I was hoping to get your opinion on whether this kind of disconnect between economic policy and military policy, if that's sustainable in the long run, the way it is currently, if, for example, can cooler heads prevail for the next 4 years without even the guarantee that the next administration in the United States is any different from the Trump administration currently. And so I'm wondering if we're kind of reaching the point where the die is cast, and that even if they decide not to go nuclear or something like that, if are we at a point where Japan and South Korea will inevitably try and take action for their own interests in a way that's completely disconnected from the United States, or if like, have we reached a point where it's just inevitable and we're just along for the ride at this point?
Well, do you mean that in an economic or a strategic sense? It's
Well,
certainly.
I guess both. I'm wondering, like, if one will inevitably impact the other, or if can we actually keep them separate?
Well, okay, in military terms, given China's size and proximity, it's very hard to see that they've got a kind of confrontational military option absent the United States. It's hard enough to do that in Europe, where you've got all these NATO allies and they've got a lot of conventional capability and so forth, but that simply doesn't exist in Asia. And so if the sense of military threat is strong enough, I think they'll just have to make a deal with China. I guess the question then would be, would they precede that with a economic deal where they actually somehow collaborate on retaliatory tariffs or try to increase, both Japan and Korea have been pulling out of China over the last decade. But they could reverse that and say, well, actually, we don't like it. We don't regard China as all that great a neighbor, but they're more reliable and we can be more certain about where they're going to go than we can of the United States. And therefore, just as a matter of hedging our bets, we're going to reverse course and begin, to reintegrate with China. That seems to me, entirely possible. And, that's much more likely than I think any kind of military, realignment. There, I just think they're going to have to cut the best deal they can.
Thank you. David, your follow-up question.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Okay. Jung-Soo, go ahead.
Thank you. Professor, you speak about the moral order, moral universe, and I presume that you consider Russia evil and America good. And I wonder what China fits in there. But my question is, if my presumption is correct, then my question is, what is your criteria for labeling Russia as evil and America good?
Well, you're the one that used that word. I didn't say they're evil. I think that they are a very nasty dictatorship that does not protect the rights of their own citizens. But there are plenty of regimes that are like that around the world right now. But they, unlike other dictatorships, also have an extremely aggressive foreign policy and vision of the world. And as I said, they would very much like to restore as much of the former Soviet Union as possible, and they're already making strides in that direction. In Georgia, they have the Georgian Dream government that's very sympathetic to Moscow. They are putting lots of pressure on Moldova. They can, in the future, put pressure on the Baltic states, and so I think that that agenda of trying to reduce the freedom and shape the internal politics of at least those neighbors is very much on the agenda. And as I said, I thought that it was a great moment when the Soviet Union fell apart and countries could determine their own fate. They could hold elections. They could make alliances and connections with other democratic parts of the world. So I think that this has been true of the United States really since the beginning. That the values underlying its own regime and the way that it has tried to make friends, really are liberal values. So I don't like the word evil. I don't think that illiberal people are necessarily evil, but I do think that that's been, some of the glue that has held us together, both with our European allies and with Japan and Korea. Of course, we also made friends with, Ferdinand Marcos and, Suharto and a lot of other people that weren't democratic. But I think, those were, kind of driven by strategic necessity. And at least we've always rhetorically maintained the view that we want both a liberal order internationally and a liberal order domestically among the people that we deal with.
Thank you. Chung-Soo, you have follow-up questions?
If I may, so the fact that Russia tries to interfere with other countries, if that makes it our opponent, then on the flip side, doesn't the United States do the same thing? For example, in Ukraine, we try to put up Zelensky and depose prior minister and so on. And South America and in America, I mean, CIA assassinated Congo or somebody in Africa, and the CIA was taking over the project from the British intelligence to overthrow the Iranian prime minister, who was a democratically elected in 1950 some years. So aren't we doing the same thing?
No, we're not. We're absolutely not doing this. No, we're absolutely not doing the same thing. I mean, yes, you have these instances, especially in the early Cold War, where we used non-democratic means to overthrow Arbenz in Guatemala, Mossadegh in Iran. We helped Pinochet in Chile. Yeah, so we did these deviations from democratic rule, but on the other hand, we facilitated democracy in many places, including in Korea. I mean, we put a lot of pressure on the Korean generals to step back in the 1980s. We facilitated the exit of Ferdinand Marcos in the Philippines. And Ukraine, we absolutely did not put Zelensky there. I mean, this is something I know very well because I spent a lot of time in Ukraine over the past decade. The Ukrainian people elected Zelensky. It was actually quite a remarkable election because there was an existing power structure in that country. He was a complete outsider. He was a comedian, who became famous because of his show Servant of the People. And as an outsider, he won an incredible majority in the election in, when was it, 2018 or 19. And he received massive democratic support in what is basically a free country. In Ukraine, you can say anything you want politically. You can criticize the president, you can criticize the elites, the oligarchs. It is a free country in a way that Russia really is not. In Russia, you can get thrown in jail for holding up a piece of white paper that doesn't say anything on it, but the authorities know that you're against the war in Ukraine. But Ukraine is basically, it's a free society. They made their own choices. And just as we supported our NATO allies throughout the whole Cold War, we saw, another imperfect but genuine democracy that was being threatened by a pretty nasty dictatorship. I guess part of the reason I feel very strongly about this particular case is that I know we've probably trained several hundred young Ukrainians over the past, over the period since 2014 in our different Stanford programs. Every one of these people would either have to flee the country or would be arrested and probably killed if the Russians actually succeeded in reabsorbing Ukraine. And so, I don't know if you want to call that evil. I think that is pretty evil, actually. But I think that, those are values that, in this particular case, the United States has supported. American foreign policy in general has not been consistent about this, and so the charges of hypocrisy are constant, and sometimes they really hit home. But I think in this case, when Jeffrey Sachs, it just drives me crazy when Jeffrey Sachs claims that the CIA put Zelensky in power. That's absolutely not the case. I know the person that started the Maidan revolution. He was one of our people, Mustafa Naim. He was a refugee who came to Ukraine from Afghanistan. When he was 8 years old, he became a journalist. He was the one that sent out the Facebook message that told people, when Yanukovych tried to pull Ukraine back into the Russian orbit. He's the one that sent out the Facebook message telling everybody to gather in the Maidan and to protest this, right? He wasn't working for the CIA, believe me. He was part of a civil society that in Ukraine is actually quite impressive. I mean, there's lots of, voluntary organizations, pro-democracy, voluntary organizations, and they were exercising their own agency, and we simply saw that and, helped them the way we've tried to help other aspiring Democrats in other parts of the world.
Very good. Daniel, Dan? Go ahead, Dan.
Hi, Dr. Kim.
Thank you.
And thank you, Dr. Fukuyama. Dan, I'm a PhD student in International Affairs at Georgia Tech and an ICAS associate. My question is, and I believe I heard you say that Trump's foreign policy could be characterized as expansionist. I'm curious, to what extent does Western culture help explain the development of that policy? And I'm drawing my question from the archives. If you recall, I guess the 28 plus years ago, the last time you spoke here, you argued that Asian values are perhaps over-indexed in explaining the failure or the rise of economic growth in Asia, rather that it was institutions that are the mediating factor. So if we flip it to the Western side today, I'm curious, to what extent do you think culture has really driven the formation of Trump's foreign policy? Or is it, in fact, not culture at all, but institutions? Or maybe even the degradation of institutions that have led here?
I certainly don't think it's culture. I think that, if it was culture, how do you explain the difference between Trump and Biden? Because they come out of the same culture, but they have radically different understandings of world order and internal order. So it's not cultural at all. I think that there was a broad change in the way that great powers thought about their power between the 19th and the 20th centuries. That was really driven. That change was, it had been building for some time, but it was really driven by Hitler and World War II, and also the Japanese expansion, because in the 19th century, most great powers were imperialists. They wanted to have an empire. The United States had a small empire because it came into that game late. But after the Spanish-American War, we acquired Cuba and the Philippines and, so forth. Japan was also a late comer to that. But when they decided that they were ready, they they developed an empire too, which Korea was a direct victim of. So everybody was doing this back in those days. It wasn't Western. It was basically what great powers did and the way they thought about things. But I think that because of the horrible nature of that kind of great power rivalry that played out over 2 world wars in the first half of the 20th century, there was really a very big change in norms. And one of the big changes that's written into the UN Charter and other documents that came out of the Second World War was this idea that you do not use military force to change boundaries, or you don't change boundaries unless it's done voluntarily. And that's in a way why the Russian full-scale invasion of Ukraine was such a shock to the system, because it was such an overt violation of that norm. So changing norms, I think, they're neither institutional nor are they cultural. I think they actually reflect the concrete experiences of countries, and many countries in the 19th and 20th century experienced colonialism and imperialism, and the imperial powers themselves suffered as a result of that kind of aggressive expansionism. And so that's why the European Union was born, because there was a theory, which I think was a pretty good one, that said that if you develop this kind of economic interdependence, this desire to acquire territory as a way of increasing national wealth is simply not going to be acceptable any longer. And, in a way, Japan was one of the best examples of that. They tried to create this military empire, an empire through military means. They did a lot of damage. They hurt their neighbors, and then they hurt themselves, suffering at the end of World War II. And what they realized after that point is they could get even richer, if they just made cars and semiconductors and, things of that sort. That's liberal economics for you. And so I think that there was this kind of recognition that liberal economics would get you even richer than you would have been, in the zero-sum great power contest that had occurred in the 19th century. And that's what you call social learning. I do believe that social learning, happens. Unfortunately, social unlearning also happens. And one of the reasons I think that we've had so much democratic backsliding is that, it's already been several generations since the end of the Second World War. You've had a lot of young people that have grown up in Europe and in Asia that have experienced nothing but continuous peace for their entire lifetimes and the lifetimes of their parents. And people just begin taking that for granted. They don't understand that that peace was the result of this extremely painful experience that, countries went through in the first half of the 20th century. And so then they can start saying, what I think are really stupid things like, well, the EU is a dictatorship, that the tyranny of the EU is just as bad as the tyranny of, Communist Party or whatever. They just don't know, and there's nothing like the actual experience of dictatorship to turn you against that form of government for a very long time. But maybe your children and maybe your grandchildren won't have those same feelings. So I think that's part of, what's going on right now.
Very good. Dan, do you have follow-up question?
In that sense, then, do you think we're bound to repeat versions of history? Is this cyclical? In the sense that whenever we achieve continued peace, it makes us take the status quo for granted, and then we spiral back into expansionist policies that, especially with more dangerous weapons, could lead to similar hazards as we saw in World War II.
Well, Steve Pinker and other people have written about this. I think that there is a danger that, we haven't learned these lessons adequately and that we will fall back into some of these old bad habits. But, I think what he and other people have documented is that in the course of human history, there's actually been a very dramatic reduction in the amount of violence and the number of people, the percentages of populations that die by violence. And so it turns out that, a lot of anthropologists now recognize that in hunter-gatherer societies, more people died by violence than in, the worst kind of Rio de Janeiro slum today. And so I do think that there is social learning over time. The problem is that technology has also been advancing. And so the ability to inflict horrendous damage on other people has grown, just exponentially. If you think about it, before the invention of gunpowder, if you wanted to kill somebody, you actually had to be physically close to them. So you could stick a sword or a pike or something, at most you could shoot them with an arrow, but you had to be actually pretty close. With the invention of gunpowder, all of a sudden you could kill people at a much greater distance. With the invention of the airplane, you could kill people at a distance of, hundreds, thousands of miles. And with the invention of nuclear weapons, you can kill millions of people instantly, relatively easily. And so there's this kind of autonomous technological evolution that's taken place. And, I think the fear that I and many other people have is that the kinds of norms that ultimately regulate the use of that kind of lethal technology are not, they can go backwards, but they certainly don't evolve as quickly as the lethality of the underlying technologies, and I think that's really what makes our current world very very dangerous.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Sean Creamer, are you ready? Go ahead.
Yes, sir. I have.
Okay.
I've been kind of tossing around in my head one or two questions to ask. So I think I'll go with sir. You mentioned you've been asked by a number of European friends what they should do, and you essentially have offered that they need to choose probably a path of rearmament to have an independent military power to serve as a balance. So along that line of thought is what I guess can the rest of the West and Europe in general do to maintain the international system that we've enjoyed the last 80 years, and one that's not dominated by authoritarian trends or so I guess where would you recommend that they best focus their energies on? What specific systems, whether it's the World Trade Organization, the United Nations, or other forums, where would you recommend they put their energies?
Well, I think that they got to do a lot of things simultaneously. So I do think that they need to invest more in their militaries, and they, in that sphere, what the United States uniquely provides is a lot of the sustainment enabling, capabilities like transport, logistics, this sort of thing. And the Europeans are very hard pressed to do that on their own. So they're going to need to build those systems independently of the United States. But that doesn't mean that they, should ignore the economic side of it. I think that if the United States is going to isolate itself from the rest of the world through tariffs, everybody else is kind of double down on, opening themselves up to trade. Now, we've seen that this kind of globalization produces a big pushback. The migration crisis that emerged after the Syrian civil war in the middle of the second decade of the 20th century was one of the consequences of uncontrolled migration. So I think that, Europe needs to think about both integration, economic integration, but they also have to be politically, smart about the way that they go about doing this. I actually think that immigration has actually been very good for almost every country that permits it, but it's also got this big downside. And I think that in the heyday of globalization, we didn't understand the kind of backlash that would occur when it's not so much that a backlash against immigration per se, it's a backlash against uncontrolled immigration. I think in this country, actually, there's a lot of poll data that supports the fact that people still believe that immigrants help the country. What they don't like to see is people spilling completely uncontrolled manner. And I think that's what happened in Europe, that Europeans, especially the Germans, really like order, and they didn't like the fact that there's all of a sudden 1 million people from the Middle East, and they couldn't keep track of them, and they really had no way of controlling that system. So I think that you need to do this kind of collaborative economic work. The big question facing Europe right now is China. And I think that China is still a big troublemaker. It was 10, 15 years ago that everybody realized that the old Chinese economic model was slowing down, and that they really need to increase demand, domestic demand for things like healthcare, education, and so forth. And instead, they do exactly the opposite. They say, no, we're actually not going to do that. We're going to double down on manufacturing and exports. And I think a lot of the trouble in the world is now, being caused by this Chinese policy. So the Europeans have a big problem, right? That they don't want to. They realize even if they wanted to integrate more with the United States isn't going to let them do that. And they've got this, threat hanging over their head from China. And I actually think that if I were a European, I would turn protectionist in at least certain key industries, because you don't want the Chinese to do to the European car industry what they did to the American car industry. I think that even if it's more efficient, even if it's better for the planet in terms of carbon emissions, the social price that they would have to pay for, that kind of economic disruption is not worth it. So, they've somehow got to trade with the people that they can trade with, but also protect these social equities that, could be at risk if they're not careful about the way that they go about it.
Very good. Sean, follow-up question.
Thank you very much. And I just want to take you in a different direction. As I've been doing a lot of thinking. So I retired from the Army after 30 years on February 1st. Kind of in my wilderness years right now, so I'm just doing a lot of reading. Started to do some writing, supporting to funded research projects with the Atlantic Council. And so I've been doing a lot of thinking about American power and where the biggest risks are over the next 10 years. And so I just would like your thoughts on where, in terms of American power, where the biggest risks are, and your thoughts on steps to minimize it. Whether it's you already addressed political disunity. That's obviously a big problem where people can't get along in their own neighborhoods. But whether it's debt, education, bloated government, the state of infrastructure, the deindustrialization that's occurred, and then the erosion of military power. Because I know you did talk about some of the strengths of American military power, but I think over the last really 25 years, a lot of that's eroded in terms of strategic lift, and and just the staying power that the United States might have had. A lot of that's just eroded. It's aged out, rusted out, worn out from overuse. So again, just would like your thoughts on that. Just would love to get your perspective.
Yeah, we obviously have to recreate a lot of our defense industrial base, because that's really deteriorated over the years. When I worked at RAND in the 1980s, when we were still in the Cold War, there's an entire part of RAND that did nothing but study the defense industrial base. And we didn't think that was necessary at the end of the Cold War. So we, even understanding, what our lack of capabilities are, is something that we don't fully understand at this point. So I don't think there's a point in all of the problems that you mentioned trying to say which is the most important or where do we have to focus. We got to deal with all of these things, right? And you got to do it. You've got to do it simultaneously and systematically. I'll just tell you what I have been particularly concerned about. As a result of my lifetime's thought about politics, I've come to realize that actually having a coherent and high capacity state is really important, and that if you as a developing country want to develop quickly, you need to have a capable state. The reason that East Asia pulled ahead of everybody else since the end of the, actually probably since the end of the 19th century, is because Japan, Korea, China all had coherent states well before they encountered the West. They did not need to see a Western model. In fact, the argument that I made in my political order, the origins of political order, was that China created the first modern bureaucratic state, almost 2,000 years before any European country did that. So they didn't have to learn how to create a bureaucracy. This was something that was culturally very much embedded in that part of the world. and no other part of the world has that kind of tradition. And Americans have a big problem with this because one of my great mentors, Seymour Martin Lipset, wrote extensively about American exceptionalism, and what he always argued is that the one most enduring characteristic of American political culture is anti-statism, distrust of government. And that, he said, came from the origins of the United States. It was a revolution against British monarchical power and so forth. And to a much greater extent than other modern democratic societies, Americans don't trust government. They don't like it. They're suspicious of it. That's good in certain ways because it's a bulwark against tyranny, but it also means that the American state is very weak. I cannot imagine another democracy doing to its own government what we are doing to our government right now. Just, arbitrarily firing, 20, 30% of the staff under some kind of assumption that they're not doing anything useful or important. I actually think that our big problem is actually a lack of state capacity. We need more bureaucrats, not fewer, but they just need to be free to actually do things in a way that one of the consequences of our distrust of bureaucrats is that we encumber them with just mountains of rules, because traditionally we don't. So if you've worked in the Pentagon or in any other American bureaucracy, what do American bureaucrats spend their time doing? They're not conspiring to take away the rights of citizens. What they're doing is trying to comply with all these rules that have been imposed on them by. There's a law professor at Stanford that's using big data to try to count the number of congressionally mandated annual reports that are required of agencies, and he says the number is something over 10,000. So if you've ever worked in the Pentagon, that's what people do in the Pentagon. They write annual reports to Congress that nobody in Congress is actually going to read. And so I think that was the problem that existed before the Trump administration, and the Trump administration is just making it a lot worse by actually taking away a lot of the existing capacity. And the thing that I worry about is that the government is just not going to be able to function. One of the best investments you can make is actually hiring more people in the enforcement division of the Internal Revenue Service. Buck for buck, that's where the biggest return is. And they've just announced they're going to cut 40% of the staff there, and they're going to start in the enforcement division. So don't worry about paying your taxes, or don't worry about getting caught in an audit. It just ain't going to happen, So I just think that there's all of these things that we're doing to ourselves that I think form the basis of American power. I was also quite upset. I am on the board of Freedom House. I was on the board of an organization that Andy has been closely associated with, the National Endowment for Democracy. And I think that's been actually a very important soft power tool of American foreign policy. And that was gutted. They just cut off their funding sometime in February. They've apparently now been forced by the courts to restore some of that funding. But, all of these things are things we're doing to ourselves. We don't have to do it. Nobody's doing it to us. We're just doing it to ourselves. And so my main concern at this particular juncture is to get us to stop harming ourselves. Because I just think that, you're not going to be able to operate internationally if you don't have the capacity and the kind of government structure that can actually make and execute policy.
Very good. Andy, you are nodding your head. Go ahead, interject your opinion, Andy.
Sorry. Yes, I'm nodding my head. I agree. So Congress allocates money to the National Endowment for Democracy. It's a congressional allocation. The administration and the NED makes grants and has commitments to other organizations. And then the administration cuts it off. That's illegal. That's against procedure. as well as what Frank said, damaging soft power.
Okay. Sean, you want to jump in? Sean Creamer, you are nodding your head too.
Yeah. Yeah, it's there's a lot to unpack there. I think just the overregulation of the U.S. government. Like you spoke about the 10,000 reports. Yeah, there's whole sections that's all that consumes at least a week out of every month that people are writing these reports. And if we can just get out of our way, it's a little bit also that you talked about just people within the government being able to make reasonable decisions. Even I've got 2 tours in the Pentagon, and and then there's this stratification of decision making, and sometimes it gets all the way up to the 4-star level, and he or she are the only ones that can make that decision, and then you're just waiting on their travel schedule for when they can get the 15 minutes that you can walk in there and brief them, and that just delays decision making and etc. So but yeah, I fully agree as well that you just can't pick one or 2 things, but we need essentially a focus and just understanding the threat that we're at. I left the Army after, like I said, after 30 years, and I just had a lot of concerns just about where the state of American power was at, and that's kind of why I'm taking a pause on going back into I'll say, or joining the labor force, and just continuing to try and just take the things that have been bouncing around my head. But I think this past year is the first year that I think it was 2024 or 2020 is when we first started spending more on debt than we did on defense, on servicing the debt, and that's just not. At some point, the spreadsheet's going to break. And in the comment you made about the IRS agents, yeah, I'm not really worried about getting audited these days. But we've had quite the leaky bucket, and you see these reports that certain types of funding, like the COVID funding, that there was a 25% wastage, that was lost through fraud. Medicare, there's a lot of overcharging. And that would be a great thing for all those IRS agents to get steered towards, just making the government more efficient and effective, and all that. And I just wrote a piece just about the state of the U.S. power grid and the water grid, and all that, and just how we're not going to be positioned over the next couple of years to compete on the international stage for the 4th industrial revolution. So there's a lot, and we just need a lot of Americans to kind of roll up their sleeves and kind of try and fix things that we've let slide.
Thank you, Sean. Hide, go ahead.
Thanks, Dr. Kim, and thank you, Dr. Fukuyama, for sharing your insights today. My name is Hide Jung. I'm a student at Azusa Pacific University, majoring in international relations and honors humanities. I'd like to ask you about the future of U.S., South Korea, and Japan cooperation. I think one of South Korea's challenges is that its foreign policy and international stance can shift significantly with each new administration. So how do you think this kind of political shift might affect trilateral cooperation in the following years? Thank you.
Well, yeah, it could affect it quite negatively. So just to lay my cards on the table, I really think that Japan and Korea need to work together in a lot of domains, in economy and in strategic affairs. And there have obviously been a lot of obstacles to doing that. And I think that American administrations have typically put a lot of effort in trying to bring that to facilitate that cooperation and to try to get them to work together more closely. And I mean, somebody in this audience may know this much better than I do, but I suspect that the Trump administration has not invested a whole lot of time in trying to promote, Japanese-Korean cooperation. I think they probably don't care, or they're just not, interested in doing that. I also think that, so Korea has just gone through this big traumatic experience with President Yoon, right? And I think it's a huge tribute to the strength of Korea's democracy that he was impeached and it was upheld, and the military or the attempted coup was reversed, and so that's a very good thing. I do worry a little bit because the opposition, the left in Korea, is also anti-Japanese and by association kind of anti-American as well. And so, although I'm glad that they won that conflict over the presidency, I worry a little bit whether, they're going to reverse the progress that I see having been made between Japan and Korea under the previous Japanese Prime Minister and President Yoon. You can tell me what you think is going to happen at this point, but I think that there's probably going to be a deterioration in that that three-way relationship because of things that are going on in Washington and because of things that are going on in Korea.
Thank you. Shreya Reddy, go ahead.
Hello, thank you. Yes, I'm Shreya Reddy. I'm based in Seoul, and I work with NK News. So I'm shifting the question a little bit to North Korea from South Korea and Japan. So since Donald Trump's return as president, he has already taken a lot of steps that appear to kind of tear up the established rules and conventions of how Washington operates. So in his first term, we saw that he was willing to do things quite differently on North Korean issues compared to how the US usually operates. This time, it so far seemed to have been taken a lower priority, but if he were to turn his attention to North Korea, how far would we expect him to go this time? And perhaps what would we expect? Any bold steps or more of the same?
So I don't know that much about, any plans among people in his administration for what to do about Korea. And I think that in this area, he can be particularly unpredictable. So I think Andy was saying earlier that with regard to China, he could flip on a dime, and go from hostility and competitiveness and so forth to saying, okay, I'm going to make the biggest deal in human history. That's what he tried to do, with the North Koreans the first time around. It didn't work. Although I take it that it didn't work because at that time he still had advisors like H.R. McMaster that I guess you're going to have come speak to you, that put some limits on how disruptive he could be. And he doesn't have that kind of person there anymore. So I would imagine that you're probably going to get some surprises, it's interesting. After relentlessly criticizing the Obama administration for the JCPOA, all of a sudden they decided, okay, Israel should not attack Iran and we should get back into a negotiation over their nuclear program. I guess the only consistent theme in that is that he really does not like the idea of using American military power anywhere. And he probably understood that if he had supported Netanyahu's attack on Iran, it would inevitably embroil the United States, right? So that you can be pretty sure of. And I think that he's not going to want to get into anything that promises to suck the United States into a conflict in Asia either. That's why I'm kind of pessimistic about how much support he's going to give Taiwan. North Korea, he'd much rather make a deal with them than have to bolster or deter them, militarily. But this is, I'm just talking because I don't really know the answer to your question.
Thank you. Chung-Soo, do you have any follow-on question?
Well, time is 8:10, so we exceeded the designated time. But if the United States or Israel attacks Iran, do you think Iran will counterattack and plunge the world economy to crisis?
I don't think they have the capability of doing that. I think that the war that they've undertaken against Israel since October 7th has demonstrated how weak they are. The Israelis basically took out all of their air defenses. They attacked, Iran directly in ways that we didn't think possible. The big deterrent that they thought they had was all of these ballistic and cruise missiles aimed at Israel, and it turned out that they were very ineffective, that Israel could defend itself against that. So I think that they're extraordinarily weak right now, and it's a little bit hard. I mean, that's why Netanyahu wants to attack them, right? Because he knows that they're weak. They're probably not going to be this vulnerable for again for a very long time, and I think that's why he wanted to undertake this military operation. There's other stuff they could do. I don't know, give away nuclear materials to other countries or fund terrorism. I mean, stuff like that. But I don't think that. I think they've been kind of exposed as having feet of clay as a result of what's happened since October 7th. Therefore, I think it's kind of limited, the kind of disruption that they could cause if they were attacked. The big problem is actually the attack itself, because it's just like the invasion of Iraq. We could overthrow Saddam Hussein without breaking a sweat, but actually then creating a sustainable system in Iraq that would then keep the peace and, behave predictably. That's something that was completely beyond our abilities. And I think you're going to face an even bigger version of this in Iran, because it's a much bigger and more capable country. And, I would not want to run a post-invasion, Iran as either an Israeli or an American.
Very good. Thank you. Ken Moriyasu, are you there? Ken.
Sorry, I'm on the train, so I cannot talk. I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead. We can hear you, Ken. Okay.
I'm sorry, I was late in joining. I wanted to ask about the restrainers in this administration. I'm sorry if you've already talked about that, but it seems like the global premises and the neoconservatives are being sidelined, and people who call for a foreign policy of realism and restraint are prevailing. Do you have thoughts on that? Thank you.
Yeah, well, like I said, I don't think it's realism and restraint. I think Trump has, expansionist ambitions. It would be nice if he were simply restrained, but I don't think that that's what he's about. A restrained person doesn't claim that he's going to grab Greenland or Panama, or any of the things that he's talked about. So I think we're in for, a lot of turbulence because of these ambitions.
Very good. Sean, question.
No, I just think that, like Dr. Fukuyama said, I think we're in for, I think we've just seen the start of it, of a little bit of the chaos. And my big, I don't want to say my big concern or first takeaway from almost the first 100 days is that President Trump is, actually weakening his hand for the rest of his term. And that I think there's a perception that internationally that he's kind of all talk, and that and he's going for more of the quick wins. And then if you actually push back, or you push hard enough, that he will cave. And it's kind of this flip-flop thing where he comes out really strong and then all of a sudden it just disappears. But I think that's just his modus operandi too, where he likes to operate in the chaos sphere and throw a lot of smoke out there, so to speak, and see what gains traction. So
thank you, Sean. Okay, Frank, time is up. And we want to say thank you very much, Frank.
Okay.
This is a great evening, and it was hot stuff. And
Okay.
we will get back to you, Frank.
Okay. I don't expect to be around in another 28 years, so
Yeah.
it's going to happen again.
Please pardon
yeah.
us. Okay.
Okay.
We
All
have
right.
good friends. Thank you, Frank.
All right. Yeah.
Let's
thank
give
you.
him a big round of applause. Thank you.
Okay. Good to talk to you.
Thank you, Frank.